You know, we love to do some tier listing every now and then, especially when a new format hits the TCG. I'm going to be sharing my initial thoughts and predictions on the format. This is without any testing being done. At this point, I've had 3 days to think about this list. I've talked to some people about their opinions on the upcoming format. I've already started to talk to some people about what they think will be good at YCS Lil, which is in this exact format. And here I'm going to share some of my thoughts on how some of these decks' positions in the meta change or not change after this new Forbidden and Limited list. Let me move one deck to the start of the discussion because most people are going to be interested in this or in my stance on this deck in particular, I guess. My first impression on Pure Snake Eye, I do believe is still a playable deck. It did not die on this ban list, which is what a lot of people wanted, and that's unfortunate for these people, me included. However, I do not believe that Snake Eye is the best deck of the format. I do think that Snake Eyes is still a top tier contender. I simply think that there are better options, and that is all it takes. If there is one other deck that is just slightly better than Snake Eyes, that will tremendously drive down the representation of Snake Eye because people played Snake Eyes because it was the best deck. So I think in this regard, the list actually did an okay job. It didn't kill it, but I don't think it's the best deck in the format any longer, and so I feel like that's fine. Branded is a deck. I probably would play Branded before I would play Pure Snake Eye. I think Branded is in an interesting spot right now because Branded not really lost much, and that's weird to say when Branded Fusion went from 3 to 1, but I don't think consistency was the issue with Branded. Branded Fusion is at 1 in Master Duel, and they even have it's 1 branded opening and 2 Alubers. So branded in Master Duel is significantly less consistent, and it's unironically a top tier deck in Master Duel since like ages. There's 2 ways to play branded. You can play a 60 card version with grass. You can play a deck closer to 40, which is the one that I would suggest. Simply because they didn't hit Sanctifier or Gimmick Puppet, I think branded is still very, very strong. It's very easy for that deck to access branded fusion, and at that point it doesn't matter if you have 3 or 1. So I think branded remains a top tier contender. Not the best deck in the format, but pretty solid. Purrely, it's all right, and I think that's exactly where I'm putting it. It might also just be a solid tier 2 deck depending on who's playing it, but I'm gonna be honest, the way I feel about Purrely is just like you're just making life harder for yourself if you play a deck like Purrely, because there's just other decks out there that do a lot of things better than Purrely and have an easier time. Like Purrely is not particularly good at playing through hand traps. Purrely is not particularly good at going second these days. Board breaker versions of Purrely are gonna be somewhat okay, but I think hand traps are still the way to go, and that always kind of feels like a little gambly with Purrely. As people are mentioning, it is a relatively cheap option, and for that, it actually does a pretty good job. I think if you are just evaluating a bunch of budget options, I think Purrely is one of the better ones of those. Tearlament, and we will talk about grass piles in a moment, but Tearlament, like 40-45 cards-ish, I don't like that much in the TCG at the moment. It depends a little bit on how popular Bestials are going to be. I think it's just all right. Yubel, in my opinion, ends up being the best deck in the format now. I think Yubel now does the things that Snake Eyes used to do. Snake Eye was a deck that was very good at playing through hand traps, made very powerful boards, and also had a lot of really good lines to play around certain hand traps, especially including Nibiru, the Primal Being, which is one of the things that Snake Eyes will now have to really struggle with when it comes to deciding what kind of combo you go for. I think the options are very limited in that regard, which just doesn't apply to the Yubel deck. The Yubel deck barely lost anything. 1 opening of the Spirit Gates, it can be annoying. It was a card that they played at usually 3 copies for good reason, so they lose something from this list, but the fact that Appaloosa is banned, I think helps Yubel more than anything else. The way I feel like it, people are going to play more Nibiru because that is the premier way on how you can beat decks like Snake Eye now, and Yubel is a deck that doesn't care about Nibiru because it has Phantom of Yubel. I think it makes the best boards now because Varudras, because the deck doesn't really care about Appaloosa being banned, and also because the Fiendsmith engine changed in a very significant way, which is that it still is good, but it gets weaker in non-Fiend decks. For Yubel, the Fiendsmith engine still does almost the same thing as it did before. You're not going to miss Beatrice much because you can just go Aerial Eater. You're not going to miss Lacrima much because you can just go Aerial Eater. There are some decks to rival it, but I think Yubel is going to be the best deck moving forward and probably my bet for the most represented deck in Top Cut at YCS Lil. Centurion is a deck that takes a pretty hefty hit from the Calamity ban. I like Centurion. I don't think now is the time for it. I mean, hand traps are going to be solid in this format, so that leaves a spot for it to be a good rogue deck. I just feel like the deck, even if it gets to play, does not create powerful enough boards. This is something that could change after Rage of the Abyss because they do get that new level 8 synchro, which is really powerful. For now, I think it remains a rogue deck. Maybe if you find the best list out there, you can make it a solid tier 2 deck, and I could see someone like maybe perform at regionals or YCSs with it. But then again, all the other decks have better tools than Centurion, I feel like. Dragon Link, I only included because Trishula TTV, instead of uploading, I think, a Banlist reaction, just uploaded a freaking Dragon Link combo now with like Rose Dragon and Adventure cards. I don't really know what to say about this. Some people seem to think it could be a solid tier 2 option. If I'm looking at the decks that I'm putting into the top tier and top tier contender category, I could see Dragon Link being solid simply based on the fact that it plays a lot of Bestials. I'm leaning more towards putting it into the rogue deck category. I think Trishula is probably on some cope there, but feel free to try it and maybe prove me wrong. Luan the Reese. Let's talk about another shifter deck right away. I think Ritual Beast is just better Floo. All of those decks I don't think are bad. If I thought these decks were bad, I would put them into the lowest category. I also just don't feel like there is a reason to play Floo right now over countless other decks in the format. Like, for example, Ritual Beast is a deck that either goes here or here. Unironically, the deck has had a pretty good showing at the EUWCQ last format. If you look at the top cut from the EUWCQ, there's only very few decks that were basically not hit at all. I guess Ritual Beast makes Appaloosa sometimes, so that's a small hit, I guess. But for the most part, you know, Yubel lost opening, lost Branded Fusion, Snake Eye got some hits, Tenpai got some hits. Ritual Beast was a deck that was already successful and pretty much stays the same. So in that regard, I think it is a top tier contender. I don't think Ritual Beast will end up being the best deck in the format by any means, but I think it is a very, very viable strategy. And here's the first thing where I need your guys' help, because I am not an expert on the Gimmick Puppet deck. I've been told that with the 2 limits to the Gimmick Puppet exceeds, the deck can still FTK, but it is less consistent now, is what I heard. The field spell still FTKs, but some other cards that did the FTK beforehand now don't do it anymore. So if you don't draw the field spell, you need to draw like combinations of multiple cards. The FTK is more fragile as well. Okay. In that case, once again, I don't have much experience on this. If you watch this on YouTube, you can probably scroll down into the comments and see some Gimmick Puppet expert saying that what I'm about to say is complete and utter garbage. But I personally think before this list, it was a solid tier 2 somewhere. And now it's probably just going to be like here. If you know better than me, feel free to enlighten me. I'm using Grass here as a placeholder for a bunch of different decks that I could imagine people playing. Basically, those sort of decks are a very viable strategy in Master Duel. They are not top tier. They are not the best deck in Master Duel. But every once in a while, when you play ranked, even at the highest level, you will run into people playing like a 60 card, all gas, no break. It's gonna main deck triple tactics thrust. So basically going second, you have access to at least 4 copies of Grass, which can really turn the game around. If you go second and you resolve Grass, you can probably break most boards. And that sort of stuff is a viable deck in Master Duel, whether it's Tearlament or people are playing Grass in Branded to just mill like Retribution and some other card advantage cards. And in the TCG, we also have other options that aren't even in Master Duel. We have the Lightsworn cards, for example. You know, I could see someone showing up with 60 card Thrust, Grass, Lightsworns, and just try to cook. Even though that sort of stuff feels very, very high rolly and gamba and all that kind of stuff, that does not necessarily mean it's bad. I think those kind of decks are something to mess around with, and I think that some sort of Grass pile could honestly be a solid tier 2 option. I think it's one of the things that if you don't like any of the top decks in the format and you just want to go to a tournament, have some fun, and potentially do well if it's your day, I think those kind of decks are the ones you're looking for, and I think they're going to be very fun. Chimera is also, I think, a solid tier 2 deck. Basically the deck that Dinka Bui piloted to a very good finish at German Nationals this year with added Fiendsmith cards into the mix and all that. I think it's pretty good. I think it's one of those archetypes that is overshadowed by the design of the Yubel cards and the Snake Eye cards. Unfortunately, it's rough, but it's still a very good deck. Kashtira feels like a slightly worse version of Floo on the Reese. All of these decks lose 1 prosperity, and that hurts. In terms of power level, I'd rather play Floo, but before I would play Floo, I would rather play Ritual Beast, is my order on the shifter decks in the format. Equation Cannon Labrynth is going to be a solid tier 2 deck, I think. Basically, this is the best version of any trap deck you're gonna get. Being able to just set 5 into those boards is nice. It also lost access to 2 copies of Skill Drain, which is a big deal sometimes, especially going second. Skill Drain was one of the better cards you could set, and losing that definitely hurts. I think the deck is still overall playable. Melodious, in my opinion, is like a bottom of tier 2 deck. I think one thing that benefits Melodious is the fact that you get more mileage out of your hand traps again. The Fiendsmith engine is getting weaker, and Snake Eye's ability to play through hand traps is also getting a little bit weaker simply because they have less access to cards like Snake Eye Ash. Melodious is a pretty good hand trap deck. Memento, in my opinion, is a top tier contender. I think this is one of those instances where this deck still makes very good use of the Fiendsmith cards. Basically, Memento still does insane 1-card combos if you really think about it. Like, we were watching Vlad's deck profile from the Euros top 64. When he showed off his combo, I was like, the fact that this is not the best deck in the game is crazy. Now that Snake Eye has been toned down a little bit, I think Memento, pure Memento, might actually just be a very viable top tier deck. It's just my impression of the deck without having played it much with the Fiendsmith cards. So take this one with a grain of salt, because out of all those decks here that I'm sorting into the top tier, this is definitely the deck I have the least amount of experience with. I think it's scary, to say the least. Runick, and this is specifically Runick Stun, in my opinion, is scary still. At least here, maybe even here. As always, with Runick, it's gonna depend on will people prepare for this deck. I'm gonna be honest with you, losing 2 skill drains for this deck is good, but for Runick Stun specifically, I feel like it doesn't matter that much. It is one of the few decks where you can just replace it with other floodgates, especially with like monster floodgates. It can just be an Inspector Border. So like there is ways for Runick Stun to make up for it. I think it's just going to be a matter of will people respect Runick Stun in deck building. I think chances are that people are aware of this deck and will have outs to it. Like, I don't know, Cosmic Cyclone is always a popular card. It is just a scary deck, and so it's going to stay in the meta for sure. I think Salamangreat is not bad. This deck feels like relatively similar to something like Illusion, where if it gets to play the game, it makes really powerful boards. Because you lock yourself into Fire/Cybers, depending on which kind of lines you go for, you will not have the ability in this deck to play the Fiendsmith cards, which is a downside. It loses to Nibiru very hard, and I think that's what's going to hold it back from being better than this. There's no way you can have Salamangreat above Melodious. Don't pay too much attention to the order here for the most part. Like, yeah, Melodious is probably better, but it's fine. In my opinion, this list did to Tenpai, for now, what it should have done. I think Tenpai loses consistency. I think Tenpai loses a lot of its non-interactive properties, right? Where you can just activate the field spell and ignore everything that your opponent does. I think Tenpai is going to be very good after Rage of the Abyss again with Molcharmi Fuvaros. I think for now, I'm not that scared of Tenpai if they don't have the field. I don't think Tenpai can ever be below top 3. I disagree. Maybe that's my bias because I don't like Tenpai that much conceptually, because I feel like Tenpai is always way much more about your opponent's ability to play the game than your own. If my opponent knows how to interact with Tenpai, then it gets much weaker. And I feel like this is an issue that gets bigger when the field spell is at 1, because then my opponent gets to interact with my deck more freely, and that's just not good for Tenpai. Maybe I'm not giving enough credit. Maybe it needs to be like, I don't think it's a top 3 deck. I've only included White Forest Runick because in my opinion, I mean, people keep asking me about this every once in a while, what I think the best Runick version in the format is at the moment. I think White Forest Runick is by far the best version of a Runick combo deck, and it remains that way, even with losing 2 skill drains. That doesn't really matter. Skill drain was a good card in that deck, but you can replace it with other good cards. Skill drain was not needed to win most of the games. I think Runick White Forest is one of those decks that I was talking about earlier that's similar to Ritual Beast. It was already able to perform to some extent in the last format, but it just didn't really receive a hit. I personally think this deck is very good. I'd put it somewhere here. It is definitely on my list of decks that I'm gonna take into consideration for YCS Lil. Shocker, I know. Josh believes in Runick decks. I think it's way easier to outgrind Snake Eye now with only 1 Poplar. Also, not having to worry about Lacrima Burn. People that play Runick understand. People that are not playing Runick will never understand how much it matters that you can't just get Lacrima burned with like 4 minutes left and then you won't have a battle phase and you basically can't win. That matters so much. Other Runick variations that I think are worth mentioning, I think Runick Bystial has the added benefit of Bystials being pretty good in the format, but I don't think that's enough reason to play it over White Forest, but it is not bad. And then another version that I wanted to mention, Red Rose Runick. Now access to triple Red Rose Dragon is also pretty cool. The problem with that deck, if you don't open Red Rose or Rux Rose Dragon, you don't have a play and you only have 6 copies of those cards, and so that's annoying. But other than that, I think the deck's pretty cool. Feel free to try it out if you like. Pure White Forest, it's not bad. Somewhere in the middle of tier 2, I would put it, I think. Rescue Ace, nothing exceptionally great about it. Not bad though. Like very scary when it goes first. Very hard to break the setup. Also not that easy to hand trap. I don't hate the Rescue Ace deck. I don't love it either. And here is the, in my opinion, best version of Snake Eye, which is Snake Eye Fire. Volcanix is missing compared to Master Duel, which is why a lot of people are asking right now, even without Volcanix. I think so, yes. I think Volcanix for this deck is not mandatory for it to be good, especially because compared to Master Duel, you can make up for those Volcanixes. You get more wanted and you get an extra bonfire, and that's fine. Like you just have more access to your Snake Eye cards. Sometimes you're gonna miss Volcanix in the deck, like not being able to pop it to get out another level 8 can be annoying. Overall, I think this deck is gonna be good though, for multiple reasons. First of all, it's very consistent because you've got 3 wanted, 3 bonfire, 3 witch, Onyx, Ash, so many starters. You've got very strong grind game. The most important part is you have very, very clean Nibiru lines, which that is one of the problems with, I think, pure Snake Eye, is there are some ways you can play around Nibiru by like pivoting into the Fiendsmith cards and making a Caesar and something, but Nibiru still hurts in those lines if it drops before the Caesar. It's not super reliable. Fire King Snake Eye can basically always outplay Nibiru. Everyone who's been playing this deck in Master Duel knows this, but Nibiru does not feel that good against Fire King Snake Eye unless you can pair it with another hand trap, which is basically the way it's been for pure Snake Eye in the TCG those last couple of formats. Like that spot in the game of combo deck that can beat Nib with 1 to 2 card combos relatively easily now belongs to Yubel and Fire King Snake Eye, which makes those 2 decks, in my opinion, the decks that can make the most powerful boards while also playing around Nibiru the best. And that's why I'm putting those 2 into top tier. Sprites, which are just pretty meh. I don't even know. This is a leftover from like last year's tier lists where I would always include Spright and always have something to say about Spright. Spright just feels power crap. Vanquish Soul is a deck that I would play before I would play Floo or Kashtira. So for me personally, it's here. I like this deck. I think you play it with Shifter. It's not bad. This is me being biased because I like this deck. I find it cool. I think in reality, it's a little bit lower than this. It's probably not better than something like Centurion or Dragon Link. Let's be real. It's probably here. Probably got to stop coping on it. Voiceless Voice goes next to these other tier 2 hand trap tiles. Got solid 1-card combos, solid room for hand trap, so it basically entirely depends on how good are those in the format. I think it is still a hand trap format, so I think you can still play Voiceless Voice if you want to. It's fallen off quite hard ever since it released, right? I feel like it released in a very solid position, and then it's just like every other deck has been getting better and better and better and better, but Voiceless has just pretty much stayed the same. They got the continuous spell to add back, but that's it. That was the second wave of Voiceless Voice support, was 1 card that was playable, which is pretty whack. I am sure that I've missed some decks that you guys are interested in if you're watching this on YouTube. Feel free to comment down below the deck that's missing or the deck that you believe in for this format. I'll make sure to try and answer as many comments as possible, as always. I hope this is a good first help for you to understand the position of decks in the format. And when I'm looking at this, honestly, I feel like after having thought about a lot of these decks and their position in the meta now, I can't help but notice that the ban list did change some things, at least in the way I perceive these decks. I think in the short term, it's fine. I think Rage of the Abyss is going to flip this whole thing on its head again, and then it's a different beast. Until then, I think it's actually not that bad. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe and all that good stuff. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.